Hi, welcome back to my channel. So Stephen King. Today I want to talk about the book Later by Stephen King. Let's start with a little bit of a summary and then I'm going to move into some of my thoughts. I will try to keep this spoiler free. If something comes up where I am going to give a spoiler, I'll give plenty of warning. So let's just get started. Later by Stephen King is a book set in New York City, and it follows this boy/young man named Jamie, and the kind of big ability that he has is that he can see dead people. So Jamie can see dead people, but only for a short period of time after they're deceased. He can also communicate with them during this window of time, but the kind of cool aspect is that somehow, because they're dead, they have to tell the truth. So if he asks them questions, they actually have to answer the questions truthfully. As you can imagine, that's a very useful skill. Jamie lives with his single mother, Tia, in New York, and she is like a book editor or copy editor or something like that. The story, it doesn't take place all in one time period. It kind of goes through Jamie's childhood, including like the earliest time where he can remember seeing a dead person, which is this man in Central Park who's in a really, really gross, gnarly accident. And he kind of realizes from then on that he's a little bit different. He's a smart kid though, so he understands that he can't really talk about this. But then their neighbor dies and he can see her and understands like what happened to her, and so it kind of comes out to his mom, and he like proves to his mom that this is a real ability because they don't know where this woman's wedding rings are, and he's like, no, she told me that she put them in this closet before she had a stroke and died because she was kind of like not her right self. So that's basically the catalyst to his abilities being known and people actually, to a certain extent, believing him. The rest of the story follows the use of his abilities in situations. His mom has this girlfriend who is a police officer. So the 2008 recession hits and Jamie's mom, like a lot of people, is in huge financial trouble as a result of that. So they're in huge financial trouble, and then their biggest client, this author who like produces pretty well selling books, ends up dying while he's writing his final book in this big series. And so she like rushes with Jamie to get there, and she brings her girlfriend Lisa along, and they rush to get there so that they can take down the rest of the story, and Tia ends up finishing the story using all of the information that Jamie gets from this deceased author. And this opens up the door to Lisa understanding and believing, to a certain extent, Jamie's abilities. Further down the road, this comes into play that she like kind of uses his abilities for various reasons. Tia and her girlfriend Liz actually end up having a falling out because Liz brings illegal substances into the home, and Tia is like, no, you can't have those in my home around my son. This is done. We're done. So a few years later, Lisa actually finds Jamie and kind of recruits him and his abilities because there's been a serial bomber who's been bombing a bunch of places, and he kills himself, and they want to know where his last bombs are. So he uses his abilities to figure this out. I'm not really going to go much further into the plot because I feel like I'm already pretty far into what the book is about right now, and I just don't want to give a lot away, but that is the overall plot. Let's move on to some of my thoughts. My first thought that I honestly thought pretty early on while reading this is that I really, really liked the setup. And this is something that I also really enjoyed about The Institute. And I did a review on that as well, so I'll leave a thing so you can go watch that if you're interested. But I love the way that this book was set up. I like the layout of it, if that makes sense, because it gives you bits of story in very digestible pieces. So I really, really appreciate that because it just gives your mind enough time to kind of like visualize and properly digest kind of the story food you're being fed. So I really like that. I also like that it was first person narrative because you really got a sense of the type of person that Jamie was through the way that he told the story. And I felt that this was a very kind of casual telling in a way because it was first person and it felt like a real person. To me, this character felt very real, and I think that that just helped so much to pull you into the story really well. The story itself initially felt a little bit derivative or like something I had read before. You know, in the book he says,
yeah, I can see dead people, but it's not like that kid in The Sixth Sense.
And then he goes on to describe it being sort of similar to the way that that kid sees dead people in The Sixth Sense. So at first you're kind of like, this doesn't feel that original, but then you realize that his abilities are actually just a catalyst for kind of the other elements of the story, if that makes sense. Like, they're definitely an interesting component, but they're not the entire story. They're more of a catalyst for other components of the story. And I think that this is one of those books where you kind of realize that the horror component that you think is the main horror component isn't the true horror of the story, if that makes sense. So I definitely experienced this a lot when I read Lovecraft Country, which had all of these supernatural, sci-fi, and horror elements. But of course, it also took place during the time of Jim Crow. So it was kind of one of those stories where the real horror or the real monster are humans. And I think that this had a similar element in that the true horror in the story comes from not necessarily the ghosts, but just humans. I like that it was, of course, a huge part of the plot, but it was not the only component of the plot. It was not the only horror element. There was more that layered on top of that story, and it was a little bit of a deeper story. I also think that the inclusion of Jamie's uncle having early onset Alzheimer's was a really, really interesting thing because that's kind of one of those real life, very relatable, very tangible sort of horrors that we all experience. And so like knowing that something runs in your family and being fearful of getting it, especially something so devastating as Alzheimer's, that was just this kind of lurking horror. So as I said, there are these layers of deeper elements of horror where it's not just a kid sees ghosts. Although, when I started the book, that's kind of what I thought it would be. And I was like, I don't know about this. And then it goes on, and you're like, oh wow, this is actually a lot more layered than I would expect. And even for the length, it honestly gets into a lot more meaty story than I would expect. Kind of in that same vein though, as much as I think the story goes on to be excellent, you could argue it's not the most original idea, but that doesn't mean it's poorly executed. I actually think that it was really well executed, but definitely one could argue that it maybe started off a little bit derivative, borrowed, what have you. There's nothing wrong with that, but he definitely does go on to develop it into its own unique and layered story. So it's okay in my opinion, but other people might be a little bit more turned off by that. This story is definitely driven by character, but it is very much driven by plot as well, because this plot moves. This plot moves really, really well. I think that the pacing is just beautifully timed. Honestly, there was never a part where I was like, this is too slow, this is too dull. But additionally, even when we hit kind of the climax and the resolution, I didn't feel so overwhelmed that I couldn't process it. And again, I think it's the pacing, but also that format where it is given to you in these digestible chunks. I also really, really like the ending. I'm not going to give it away, but if you have also read this book, maybe we can discuss it in the comments, because I thought that it was, again, that interesting insight into kind of the real horrors at play, and I don't know, I wasn't expecting it to go there. So you let me know, if you've read this, were you expecting it to go there in the end? Because I was kind of like, whoa, it was a surprise to me. I think that this is a great read if you want something that's not going to be too long, that's really well paced, that deals with layered horror aspects, so there's more than one sort of type of horror. I think that this would be a great book for a lot of people. Beautifully paced, beautifully timed. I really liked the layout, and I loved the first person narrative and how we got into Jamie's brain. He's kind of a relaxed character, I think, because he's just seen so much at this point. He's like, I've seen and heard and experienced so much in my short time on this planet already that I'm just relaxed about it all in a sense. And so I kind of liked that we got that narrative so we could understand who he was as a character more. But yeah, I would highly recommend this to anybody who is a fan of the horror genre. Even if you only casually read like horror, scary, thriller books, I think you would enjoy this because it has a couple different elements. And yeah, as I said, it's just a good book. What can I say? I actually give it 5 out of 5. I did it! I'm giving it 5 out of 5. That's about all I have to say for this, so I think that that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments below if you've also read this book, and I will see you later.